Yeah, it's called Conversations with Jeff, not Screaming Matches.
Yeah, you and I do not agree on Calvinism. But look how nice we are to each other.
I think it's going to really shock a lot of people, thrill a lot of people. A lot of people are going to have to do some soul searching.
It's like, you know what? What are you doing? You're spending all your time trying to destroy another Christian day because you don't understand what's going on, when you should be out there winning people for Jesus.
Right.
Thank you for the job you're doing. Thanks for being willing to address these kind of issues. They're vital to the church.
I feel sorry for what's coming your way, but God bless you, man. It's a good, healthy conversation, and let's keep growing together in the Lord.
People won't change unless they hear the truth, though. And so we need to know the truth, speak the truth, and then the last one I would say is that we need to stay in the truth, no matter what the consequences are.
Okay, everybody, welcome to today's episode of Conversations with Jeff. As always, putting out a new podcast pretty much every day. Yesterday we had on Mindy Robinson, which was a great conversation on conservatism. A lot of her platform as she's running for Congress in Nevada. It's also going to be the very first episode of Conversations with Jeff that we are going to have a parental advisory for. So if you're cool with that, check that out. It was a fascinating conversation. Also, a reminder as well before we get started, we are working on a new project with J.D. Rucker, Sam Jones, Ken Peters, called the American Conservative Movement. We've got our upcoming conference that we're putting on April 18th. It's going to be an online conference just like we did with the Destroy Social Justice Conference. Got a great lineup of speakers, including Michael Johns, co-founder of the Tea Party, Jerry Wayne, the guy who got into an argument with Joe Biden, and they debated over AR-14s. We got Greg Lott coming back. We got Mindy Robinson. We got a great lineup of people. So definitely check that out. If you go to AmericanConservativeMovement.com, you guys can fill out the information. Get on our email news list. We are going to be trying to do everything we can to unify around conservative values, conservative messaging. We've already had several thousand people sign up for our email newsletter, so make sure you check that out. We'll be updating you with a lot of really cool, exciting announcements over there, so definitely go there, AmericanConservativeMovement.com. Excited today. We're bringing back Pastor Sam Jones, which I believe this is like officially you're setting the all-time conversations record for the most times guesting on the show. So welcome back.
Hey, it's great to be here. I was getting kind of nervous there because you're doing these conversations all the time. And so I was like going, oh man, somebody's going to catch me here pretty soon. So I gotta get back on.
I know. You got to put some distance between you and second place.
That's right. I mean, it's getting crazy out there. And of course you're doing the, is A Nation Held Hostage? Is that what it's called?
America Held Hostage. Yeah.
America Held Hostage.
Yeah.
In the, morning for you. I guess it's like 11 o'clock here, so I guess that's still in the morning. But
yeah, it's like 9 a.m. when we do it here, so I'm still sipping my coffee.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but it's been fun. It's been fun too with we've got like a bunch of new shows we're putting out. We've got the America Held Hostage, which is our daily news show that John Hinton and I are doing, just breaking down the news like every morning for about a half an hour or so. And then we brought on Rucker Report, and then we've got a new show with you coming out here. We're going to be putting out later today. Called Monuments. Share a little bit about what you're doing with that podcast and what gave you that idea.
Yeah, so it's called Monuments, and I'm kind of a history buff, and I really like podcasting too. Some of you probably have noticed that. I'm going to turn myself down just a little bit. It's coming in a little hot. I don't know if that helps out or not, but I really enjoy doing podcasts, and I'm a history buff. Really enjoy history, and this year I was actually kind of thinking through some different kind of podcast ideas over Christmas break. So you have a little bit of time there where things are a little bit slowed down, and I'm just going, wow, I got time to think. I got all this time to do these podcasts, and then real life starts up and you don't really have time. But coronavirus hit, and it's like, oh yeah, I have this list of different podcast ideas, and one of them was monuments, and the idea there is actually comes from a song, one of my favorite bands or groups. It's a Southern gospel group called Legacy 5. Years ago, they sang this song, Monuments, and it asked the question, where are the monuments we should be building so our children can find the way to get home? And this year, my wife and I, we adopted a child. His name's Thomas, and just kind of thinking of that, going, I'd like to build up some monuments for him. And so the podcast series is actually dedicated to him. And basically, we're going through different monuments or different pieces of history that I think are important for everybody to remember. And so I'm not necessarily addressing my son in that, but just kind of going and making it for everybody. But it is with him in mind. And I think the first episode is on the Declaration of Independence. The second one is on the Haddock Memorial, which most people probably have no idea what that is. And I'm just going to leave it at that, but it's great. It goes over the first martyr in Iowa, first Christian martyr in Iowa. And the one I was just getting prepared before we had this was not going to be on the New England Primer. And so I'm excited for that. The goal is to look at history. And of course, I'm taking some history it's probably going to be all American history and looking at that and then tying it into Scripture, finding a scriptural application and something that we need to remember history and learn from that and stay in the right path according to history. Yeah. So yeah, I'm excited for that.
Yeah, I'm really excited to listen to it. I listened to the first episode that you sent over that we're going to be posting later today. Really cool. Again, diving into American history. And that's the thing is, like, I feel like both in secular society and within the Christian church, nobody really talks about American history anymore at all. And you would think that, especially as Christians, that's definitely something that we should be talking about because, our American history is so deeply rooted in our faith and that sort of thing. And so to me, that's something that we should be talking about more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the revolution really started from the pulpit. It didn't start actually, in a political figures getting together and sitting around a table and going, we need to start a revolution. And it didn't start, as the secular history would say, because people got mad about a tea tax or a stamp tax or something like that. I mean, there's no doubt people did get upset about those things. But really, it started from the Black Robed Regiment, which, Peter Muhlenberg and Jonathan Mayhew are a couple of the key pastors in that time who really stood up and they preached these messages. Jonathan Mayhew's message on Romans 13 that really went, and he gave a discourse that actually ended up being preserved as a scholar select by our secular government. We view this as a document, his sermon. This discourse on Romans 13, and should we have unlimited or limited view of submission to government? And of course, he goes out there and says, a government has to be submitted to God, otherwise it's not a real government, essentially. And then Peter Muhlenberg, he went out and preached a sermon out of Ecclesiastes and said, there's a time for war and there's a time for peace, and basically said, now is the time. And then he disrobes and has a continental outfit, or not outfit, but a continental uniform on underneath it, and he ended up being a general by the time it all ended up being done, as he led his church out to actually create a regiment in the Continental War. And so, I mean, the church played a very significant role in that. And today what we find is that pietism has really gone, and I know we've talked a lot about pietism before, but pietism has really gone and hammered the church, and that's really where we find ourselves, and that's what we're seeing play out today. It's kind of crazy to go and look at the pietism play out and say, well, the government said so we're just going to close our doors. We're not going to do anything. The government knows best. We're just going to bow down to the government.
Yeah, which I think really kind of ties back into kind of what we're seeing happening today, where the government is being overbearing and overstepping its bounds and things like that. And so I think, that and I know we've talked about this before, but dealing with Romans 13, and there is the critique of our founding fathers coming out of a lot of, evangelical pastors of saying that, our nation was founded in sin. They rebelled against the government unbiblically and in sin. And, even right now, we should just submit and obey, essentially no matter what they say. And now we're literally seeing them shutting down our churches and, taking away a lot of our constitutional rights. And so as Christians, I already know the answer, but A, was America founded in sin? And B, how do we as believers respond when the government's telling us to do these things that are literally taking away our rights?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my answer is that no, our nation wasn't founded in sin. One of the first acts of Congress was to order, I believe it was 30,000 Bibles, because the British had gone and blockaded us so that we couldn't get Bibles in. And so it was to buy 30,000 Bibles and have them printed in the United States. That was one of the first acts of Congress, which, I mean, when you look at it in those ways, it's like, oh, wait, maybe it was more than just a political thing that was going on. There was actual spiritual warfare that was happening too. And of course, that's because the Bible isn't just a book of religious tenets. It is actually gives us, as it says, all that pertains to life and godliness. And so if we want to know how to live best according politically, we live according to the Bible, and it tells us exactly that, or how to do that. And, one thing I think that we need to kind of go over, because when you look at the grand scope of history, especially church history, the 1700s, especially the late 1700s, really wasn't that long ago. And I think a lot of people will go out and say, well, the 1700s, that wasn't that long ago. And most people really only go back to the Reformation, or that's kind of the big time frame, as they say, the Reformation. And so they'll go and say, well, this whole take on Romans 13 that I would take, and that Jonathan Mayhew took, and Peter Muhlenberg and other people are taking today, they would say, that's kind of a new thing. It's an American thing. It's just from American culture and things like that. But the issue is that in Germany in 1550, which I believe is before the Reformation, there, the pastors of Magdeburg, Germany, got together and they stood against, I believe it was Philip V. Stood against him and actually put forth the doctrine of lesser magistrates, or the doctrine of the interposition, we might say, where it says that those who are in lower authority naturally can go and oppose those in higher authority if those in higher authority are going against God's word. And of course, we could go back all the way to Acts chapter 5, where the church is essentially established on saying we would rather obey God than man. So therefore saying that the civil government needs to obey God in order to be right, in order for us to obey, which is all we're trying to say with Romans 13.
Yeah, well, and even looking at, if I'm remembering my church history correct, Martin Luther was on the run from governments. He put his 95 Thesis up on the door, and he was pretty much fleeing the rest of his life. I mean, it's not like the authorities came along like, hey, you know what, you broke the rules, and he's like, okay, cool, I'm going to submit to you guys. I'm going to come in, and you guys can burn me at the stake. He's like, no, I'm gonna flee for my life. Right, and that's what I look at is all these people. They're saying, Romans 13. Well, we realize that the Apostle Paul lost his life at the hands of a civil government, right? They don't kill you for obeying a civil government. So Romans 13 is not an unlimited thing, just looking at even the life of Paul. And of course, we could say the same about several other apostles and, of course, Jesus Christ himself, which really puts you in some weird place there if you're going to say that we have to have a standard that's greater than Jesus, Yeah. Now, what do you make with the seemingly uninterest in American history by our evangelical leaders? Because it seems like it's almost like there's literally no discussion about it anymore. I remember growing up, and it was we used to, in church, we used to have the American flag up on stage. It was much more patriotic and things like that. And it seems like now in the evangelical world, it's there's this separation. What do you make of that? Yeah, so there are about three different things to my mind. One is when you said the word separation, there's this term called separation of church and state, which that phrase was coined in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists, where he said, we'll build a wall of separation.
And we just took that phrase then, the separation of church and state, and we ran with it, of like these two things are totally separate. And in some senses, they are totally separate, but it's not that in the sense of you don't take your faith and apply it to politics. That's not how it's separate. It's the idea of the church, or excuse me, the state has no business in ecclesiastical law, which, just to make it, really about what's happening today, I do believe when we have services is part of ecclesiastical law. And if it's not a part of ecclesiastical law, then we have a lot of apologizing to do to the Seventh-day Adventist. And I'm not saying that was their only issue, but we do kind of come out there and we hammer on Seventh-day Adventists as saying, no, it's the first day of the week, not the last day, not Saturday. It's Sunday. It's the Lord's Day. We have quite a bit of apologizing to do if we're going to take the opinion that when the church gathers together isn't part of ecclesiastical law. Like, that's just a ridiculous position that people are holding. And so one is that idea of we've misjudged that idea of separation of church and state. Another thing as to why I think that the American church has left out American history or quit talking about it is a lot of our education system. And I'm not necessarily an expert in this, but I do know that our education system has started to omit some history, has started to revise some history. Most people really only go and they look at Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and Thomas Paine are the three main characters in the Revolutionary War. And there's no doubt they were three main characters in the Revolutionary War. Thomas Paine with common sense, Ben Franklin as the elder statesman, and Thomas Jefferson as the framer of the Declaration of Independence. But there were a lot of other guys that were just as prominent, and they were a lot more Christian, these other people, whereas in Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Paine are probably the three least Christian people. And Jefferson and Franklin we would probably deem as more heterodox Christianity. Still, they would probably claim Christ. I don't believe we'll see them in heaven. I believe they were heterodox outside of orthodoxy, but they still were probably, at least in a social sense, considered Christian. They both went to church and things like that. Thomas Paine wasn't. There's no doubt about that. But when we look at that, I think there's kind of that revisionist history and omitting of history that plays into this a little bit just within our culture. Our whole culture doesn't understand Christianity. And the other thing that really has come about that I think attacks this is this thing called situation ethics, which was a book that was written in the late 60s by Francis Fletcher. And he really, this whole idea was to bring in more of a relative morality into the church. And it really has brought into a more relative morality in the church. A lot of people have a more relative morality, even if they don't want to admit it. And with that, it brings us a rejection of history because it's more about our feelings. And of course, our history was very much based on objective truth as opposed to subjective truth. And so we don't really want to go into follow that kind of thinking.
Yeah, and I feel like that, we're seeing like you were saying, we're seeing it both in the secular world and within Christianity. And one of those things that we are seeing is, there is this attack on the monuments of our country too, and things that are symbolizing the past, and especially pretty much anybody who owned a slave. It's like we got to get rid of that memory. It's like it's this cancel culture, but applying it towards history, which is very strange and very interesting. What's your take as like a pastor looking at these things where you're looking at, okay, that guy was clearly flawed. He owned slaves. He was a slaveholder. That must mean he was a racist. Should we be having these memorials to people like that?
I think that's an absolutely great question. And when you said the word cancel culture in there, I think that really helps set exactly what's happening and where we're going wrong here with our response to these monuments and things like that. In cancel culture, it's just a complete polarization. And we see this in almost every area of our culture today. People go and they look at, and it's either this person never did anything wrong or this person never did anything right. And if we look at some prominent figures in Christianity, in probably more in we can even look in Christianity, but in the Jewish side of things, in the Old Testament, when we start there, you look at Moses. Well, Moses was a murderer. You look at Abraham. Abraham lied about his wife being his sister twice. You look at David. David murdered, and then he also committed adultery. He had multiple wives, all these kind of things. Are we going to go and look at those people and say they never did anything right? I mean, the Apostle Paul, for goodness sakes, he was a Christian killer. I mean, his hobby was, hey, let's go kill Christians today or throw them in jail. Are we going to, just look at those things and say, okay, because they did these bad things, they never did anything right? No, that's the wrong way to look at it. It's also wrong to deny that they ever did anything wrong. And that's important to understand. There is a balance, and of course, these monuments, no matter who we put a monument up to, unless it's Jesus Christ, these people have committed sins, some more egregious than others, but that doesn't necessarily take away their value in what they contributed to society, what they contributed to our nation, what they contributed to a church or something like that. And so as we go and we look at it that way, we do need to go and look at it and say, okay, yes, they did some things that were wrong, and we can learn from their negative examples. But then we should also go and look at the things that they did right and learn from their positive examples and walk in those things.
Yeah, another example that comes to mind would be Martin Luther. Because he said some pretty anti-Semitic things, especially later on in his life. But to me, it's like we should totally condemn those things that he said, but that doesn't invalidate the good that he did as well. And I think and this is just my take on it, not to get too controversial, but I think that this is where I think a lot of people in the quote unquote discernment world or polemics world get things wrong, is that people are either labeled 100% good, and you can never criticize them because they've been a faithful pastor for 50 years and could, how dare you ever criticize them, or the person is totally wrong because of a particular belief that they have, and then you can never say anything good about them. And I feel like this is no longer discernment or discerning between good and bad in situations. It's now labeling somebody a full-on heretic or a full-on apostle. Is essentially what it's coming down to, and I find that concerning.
Yeah, well, so the example you brought up was Martin Luther. I'm not Lutheran. I'm Baptist. On top of that, I'm not even a Reformed Baptist. People like to go and say they're Reformed Baptists and things like that. And I'm going, I don't know if you understand Baptist history, but that's okay. And we look at Luther. So I don't really have a ton in common theologically with Luther. We still sing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," and it still says Martin Luther wrote that because he did. And I think that's a wonderful song. And that's not the only good thing that Martin Luther did, but it's just an example of something that even in a non-Reformed Baptist church, we still do actually, in some instances, in some ways, praise Martin Luther for what he did, even though we would disagree even on some of the quote-unquote good things that he did. We would have some disagreements with that. And I think you're exactly right in the polemics and the discernment world, is that a lot of it is we're not really discerning between right and almost right. A lot of times we're just trying to go and instead of being a polemic, we're trying to polarize people, which there's a difference there. A polemic, of course, it can be a harsh criticism, and there's nothing wrong with harsh criticisms. Jesus gave harsh criticisms. Paul gave harsh criticisms. The thing is that we have to remember Jesus looked at Peter and he said, "Get thou behind me, Satan." And he also called him his friend. And Jesus was not a double-minded guy. Of course we know that. It's that idea of in that moment, he's going and really hammering what's going on.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think that it's where we really need to get into we really need to get into what's right and wrong, and maybe take a step back from all the labels that we try. It's like we try to stereotype people too much, and we try to label people too much, as opposed to taking things on like a case-by-case basis. I feel like that's more of a discerning way of handling things, and I think we can apply that to like American history. We could say, look, that person owned a slave. That was wrong. That person was racist. That was wrong. But then they also did promote freedom and liberty for everybody as much as they possibly could at that time. Like there's certain things that's like if we discern the context, we discern what's going on, and I think that applies both within the Christian theological realm and then also like the political societal realm as well. And I think that's something that's missing on all fronts.
Right, and one example in the political realm is Thomas Massey. Just recently, he got absolutely crucified for basically making the House do their job and voting, and then plus he voted no. On top of that, and the reality of it is that if you would have asked Donald Trump 2 months ago if he would have signed off on this, he would have said no. Because at that time, now I would, in my opinion, I'm not a fan of the stimulus bill. I would say that was a bad decision to sign that bill into law. And I understand there's going to be some arguments and things like that. I err on the side of principle is what I would say, and that's kind of where I take some things. But I mean, Thomas Massey, for a principle that is literally in the Republican platform, gets crucified, gets called a traitor. And things like that. And it's just like that. That's ridiculous. That's literally in the Republican platform that he would say no to this.
Yeah.
He's just erring on the side of principle.
Well, I mean, think about it. Like under Obama, what did he sign? Like an $800 billion bill, a stimulus bill? And Republicans were like, that's way too much money. Can you imagine how much debt we're going in for that? Like, I can't believe that you would do that. And he's over there trying to stimulate the economy that was struggling at that time. And I'm not saying it was right by any means. I was totally opposed to it. But then Trump comes around and is bragging about that it's the largest stimulus in the history of our country, and which is true. And it's like one Republican voted against it, if I remember. It was just Thomas Massey, who was the only one that voted, right?
Right. And I think that I'm not sure, so don't quote me on this, but I think that both Rand Paul and Ted Cruz were sick with the coronavirus at the time and were not able to vote.
Yeah,
and I know that they would vote the right way.
Yeah, I know that Rand had said that it had applauded Thomas Massey for that as well, so that was good on him.
Right. So I don't want to create this hero mentality out of Thomas Massey, but I do want to praise him for what he did, because that is a tough stand. It would be tough to stand on your own, and I mean, Trump is missing out on his opportunity if he wants to go and say that this is the biggest stimulus bill in our country's history. I mean, he can go beyond that. It's the biggest bill in the world, biggest stimulus package in the world's history. I mean, it's incredibly large.
Yeah, well, and I think that that just bringing Trump into this too makes for a fascinating conversation, because what we're talking about totally applies to the whole Trump scenario, where you've got the never Trumpers and the Democrats that basically compare him to like a Hitler, right? He's like, he can never do anything right. And then you've got the hardcore MAGA crowd that's like, he can only do right, he can't do any wrong. And then there's only a handful of people in the middle where we're like, well, he did that right, he did that wrong, why can't we just call balls and strikes? And I feel like that's what's totally missing surrounding Trump, is like, he's not all good, he's not all bad, let's just call it for what it is. Right.
And I think that's the way we really should approach any president. And it is a little tougher when there's a Republican president or somebody who would definitely be framed in that idea of conservatism for conservative Christianity. When Trump moved the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, I applauded him. And I've been a huge critic of Donald Trump. I'll be the first to admit that. I've been a huge critic, and I mean, it's because I think if you look at his policies, he just signed the biggest stimulus package. Right now, economically, you could honestly make an argument that Donald Trump has been one of the most liberal presidents we've ever had. Now, I understand people might say, well, in context, it's a little different. I understand that. But still, just looking at straight facts, I think it'd be, he just passed FDR on that with this New Deal. It's a little tough to look at that. He's also, of course, not a total social conservative, which makes it difficult. Now, and we go and we look at that. I think that we need to call balls and strikes where Trump does well. I think it's great that he has spoke out well for the unborn. I think it's really bad that he's given $615 million, I hope it's million and not billion, 615 million to Planned Parenthood, signed off on bills, because the reality of it is he does have to sign a signature, put a signature on that. He could take a bigger stand. And I wish he would, but I do praise him when he speaks out well on these things. And I think that's the balanced approach, is to actually look at truth and to say, okay, this is what's right, this is what's wrong. And if he's on the right side of the issue, praise him. If he's on the wrong side of the issue, say, hey, you need to do better, Trump. And that's not just for Donald Trump. That's for anyone, though.
Yeah, well, and I feel like that's the approach that I think we need to be taking in general. And that's the thing, is like, as Americans and as Christians, we can disagree on some of those details, and we can debate some of those details. But I feel like it's those details that we need to be debating, not the person necessarily, because it's like, again, like we were saying before, somebody doesn't only do all bad, and they don't only do all good. And again, we have to put that in context, because we are all sinners, and we all, without Christ, we can do no right. But within like this specific context, it is important that we are calling balls and strikes on those specific situations. And it's like, there's this crazy cancel culture that it's like Trump is only all bad, or he's literally the Messiah. There's no like middle ground at all anywhere.
Right. And the Messiah talk always just, scares me, because I'm going, oh, no, I really don't think Trump's the Antichrist. So, yeah. And that's the next Messiah that's going to come, a fake one. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And I think that we do need to take a step back and actually get a large dose of reality. And by reality, I don't mean going and trying to find faults in your favorite characters or something like that. What I mean by that is actually going looking at saying what's right, what's wrong, and then use that measure to make our decisions and to make our praises or our condemnations of what's right and what's wrong, and to look in the exact specific areas that we're talking about.
Yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to, talk to you a little bit about is, you do have your book that you got coming up this summer called 5 Steps to Kill a Nation. And
coronavirus is not one of the chapters, so just going to throw that out there.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it is ironic that was the title right around now. But what's the main premise of the book, in the sense of, I mean, clearly you're seeing, okay, our country is getting destroyed from within. What are you looking at where you're like, okay, this needs a book like this to be able to deal with this issue?
Yeah, so really looking at the foundational issues as to how America got where we are. And I may have to go and revise some of the chapters, just because, talk about an acceleration that has happened here over the last month. I mean, I've been working on this for probably 6 months or so, and it's like all of a sudden it's like, whoa, my book might be outdated before it even comes out. But no, it really goes over, and the premise is the moral foundation, because the moral foundation for an individual, a nation, a church, whatever institution you look at, the moral fabric and foundation is found in the Ten Commandments. And especially when we look at Western civilization, which America is founded on Western civilization, which is essentially taking the questions of the Greek philosophers, who they asked great question like, do we need objective justice, things like that, and answering that. And they came up with the right answers. They would say yes, but then they couldn't define what objective justice is. The Ten Commandments gives those answers. And so going in and looking at those things and seeing how America started, and then where America started to fall short in these different things, whether it's decaying the family is one. And, it's not just in the sense of sexual immorality when we think about that through homosexuality or through premarital sex or through that kind of stuff. It's also through the idea of children in their relationship to their parents. In our society, we look at a whole lot more of it's the school's job to form and to shape and to mold children. And by school's job, I mean we view the secular government's job to do such a thing. And in reality, the Bible tells us, no, that's the parents' job. And of course, that's the best way to pass down values. And when we look at that when that process is taken away, then we have a whole generation that has a different set of values than the generation or two generations before them, perhaps, would be the way to look at that. And I think that we're starting to see some of those things. There's a high percentage, I think it's somewhere like 67% of millennials wouldn't be opposed to socialism. And of course, we might be getting to test that out with a new stimulus package here, socialism here in the next 8 years or so. And so in socialism, I think is covetousness and it's theft, and which of course that's two of the 10 Commandments say: don't covet and don't steal. And we look at that will destroy a nation by through their economy. And we can go and look in of course, all the 10 Commandments. We can look at that. I narrowed it down to 5 different principles from the 10 Commandments instead of going and looking at them individually. Put the first 4 together, and then a couple others tie in together because I think they really play off of each other. And we can see that in our nation. Right now I'm working on the last chapter, and the last chapter I'm working on is thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, or thou shalt not lie. And it's really looking at this idea of hating our neighbor. And right now, is there any more distrust in our neighbors than what we have right now? I mean, we have mayors, just the mayor in the town 5 minutes away from here in the large, well-known town, came out and said, hey, if you see people who aren't social distancing, call the cops on them. Give us a call. I had a friend who they had it was his dad's 70th birthday party, and they're sitting out, and what they did was they went out and got chairs, got them all social distance, 6 feet apart, in the lawn. They're outside, nobody's close together, nobody's touching each other, nobody's doing anything like that. And the cops came and told them, somebody called us, that you guys aren't social distancing, and so you guys need to disperse. I mean, and we're in Iowa. We're not even in a stay-at-home order yet. We might be by the end of the week or something like that. But we're one of the few states that aren't under that ordinance yet. But there's a huge distrust amongst our neighbors, and it comes to this idea that as a society, we have left the truth behind, and I guess that's really what I've been thinking about, and really seeing that in this whole COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, and it was really interesting looking at, reading some like articles that are out there really dealing with like a lot of these issues you're talking about. And like one of them that came to mind when you were talking was there was an article about there was a school principal who sent a letter home to the parents telling them, don't homeschool your kids, leave that to the teachers, because that's the teacher's job. That's not your job. Just play games with them, have fun. Take it easy, that sort of thing, and leave the teaching to the professionals. And it seems like that is the common thought process amongst both government and then also amongst parents. Like parents are like, no, I'll just leave. I'll let the school do all the hard stuff. Let me just do the fun and the games and that sort of thing. When from a more biblical perspective, that's not necessarily the way things are supposed to be.
Right. I mean, essentially what you're getting out and what you're saying here from this article is that people are saying, look, the state knows what's best. The government knows what's best. And, the big problem is here, we can either believe that government knows what's best or God knows what's best. And, whether we go back to the Neo-Babylonian Empire with Nebuchadnezzar and we look at his life, he was, the gold head, according to his vision that God gave him and that Daniel interpreted. He's the gold standard. But yet he spent time as a wild animal, essentially eating grass and insane. And why did he spend it insane? It's not because he wasn't a good king from a secular standpoint. It wasn't that he wasn't a good leader. He was a great leader, the best leader we've ever seen. But it was because he failed to recognize that God is greater than him. And so we can either say that government knows best or God knows best. And a government that actually does know best knows that God knows what's best. And when the state comes out and says, you know what, you guys don't worry about it. You don't need to parent your children. We'll instill the values. We'll instill the education. We'll instill these kind of things into your children. What they're saying is, we know better than you. Let the state take care of it. And that's a major problem. That's a totally unbiblical worldview. Even if you send your children to public school, you need to go and be going and being active in the education of your child, finding out what is your child learning, finding out are they learning, what's accurate and what is truthful and according to the Bible and different things like that. It's still ultimately the parent's responsibility to educate their child, even if they're sending their child to a public school.
Yeah, and well, and the thing is too is like school used to, again, if we're going back to like the founding of our nation and leading up, for probably the first 100 years, 150 years, it was mostly teaching them like actual education things like history and math and English and how to write and do all those kinds of things. And now it's turned into more social studies and feeling good and Common Core math, which literally makes absolutely no sense at all to me. And I feel like it's shifted into more of a brainwashing type education system than an actual facts and figures type education system, which I think is really what's leading to this really downfall and crumbling of our society right now, when you've got the majority of millennials that think socialism works and big government knows best.
Right. And I'm going to say something that might not be taken the right way. And if somebody wants to clip this, they'll probably really make me look bad. So hopefully you don't do that. But I'll never forget being in a Sunday school class when I was probably 16 years old. And I was in there, and the Sunday school teacher was giving an illustration. It was in the summer. I went to a smaller church, so at this time the high school got moved into the adult class, and I don't even remember what the whole class was on, but I remember his introduction, and he says, somebody confronted me this week and said, it sounds like you're brainwashing your children. And his response was, he said, I looked at that person, I said, well, if I'm not brainwashing them, who is? And I'm not saying that in the sense of that we need to go brainwashing people. That's not really what I'm getting at. But what I'm getting at is, if you're not the one instilling the moral fabric and the moral foundation into your children, somebody else is. And I guarantee you, chances are anyway, maybe I won't guarantee, chances are it's not going to be the moral foundation of the Word of God.
Yeah, and that seems like that's one of the mentalities of a lot of parents today is, I want to let my kid decide for themselves. So I'm just going to kind of take a hands-off approach, and I've got my beliefs, but I'm not going to force it on them, and I'm just going to let them make up their own decisions. So instead of that, how should parents specifically be raising up their kids?
Right. Well, they should be raising up their child in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. They should be going and teaching it. They should be going in and teaching the Word of God, going and instilling the principles of the Word of God. And God's Word, it teaches science, it teaches history, it teaches morality. Of course, it teaches religion. I mean, that's kind of the given one. It teaches politics, teaches government, teaches pretty much anything you need to know. And I'm sure the math in the Bible is better than Common Core, that's for sure. But it teaches all these things. And so there needs to be a common discussion of the Bible within the family. Growing up, I was blessed. My parents didn't get saved early in life, but they did get saved early in their parenthood. And so I was blessed to live what I would say really only knowing a Christian family, although at arm's reach, I definitely had some unsafe family members and things like that. But I can't really remember a day going by in my informative years of a time where we didn't talk about God's Word. And of course, it wasn't just list off the facts, list the Ten Commandments. Well, that's good if you can list the Ten Commandments or quote the Bible, the books of the Bible. That's good if you can learn those things. But the discussions we had were, this is what I learned in my devotions today, and this is how it applied to my life. And so speaking specifically to that application, that's absolutely vital in teaching children how the Word of God applies to the life. It's not just religious tenets, although it's good to memorize verses. It's good to memorize these things, to know these things, but it does actually have action. The rubber does meet the road when it comes to the Bible.
Yeah. Now, you and I, as well as J.D. Rucker and Ken Peters, we've been working on a project called the American Conservative Movement, And I think that one of the questions that I want to ask you is, when you're looking at moving forward, you're looking at the future of our country and pushing like conservatism and even biblical values into society and things like that. Do you feel like there's certain things that we need to be focusing on first if we want to, really, save our country, and then things that are like secondary issues? Or do you think that we just need to have the full on conservative values overall, and we just need to, push it all? Like, do you feel like there's certain priorities or secondary issues, or how do you view all that?
Yeah, so I think that there's always a horse before the cart, right? There are those two things, and I would say the horse in this scenario, because we don't want to get the cart ahead of the horse here. The horse in this scenario, I think, is righteousness. Book of Proverbs says that righteousness exalteth the nation, but sin is a reproach to any people, and any people, that includes the United States. And for the last probably, at least since the Roe versus Wade decision, so 73, I think is when that was, we've been going out and saying, we're the exception to the rule. God's hand of blessing is still upon us. Really, I think, in what we're seeing, and this is where we're really in a dangerous spot with this COVID-19 thing, even if this virus kills millions of people, we're still in a very dangerous spot because of the attacks on our liberty. And we're starting to pay back the ungodliness that we have accumulated. Our account has been filling up with ungodliness. And the thing is that sin is a reproach to any people, and we're starting to see that reproach. We don't trust the government, is what people would like to go out and say. And of course, people would rail that against me. I've been reading the Federalist Papers, and I can't remember if it was Federalist 1 or 2, but it goes and it attacks that idea that some people will want liberty and not trust the government. And it was saying it in a negative light, kind of funny from our founding fathers. But right now, what we're seeing with this whole COVID-19 is actually the exact opposite. People say you don't trust the government. Well, that's true. To some point, I don't trust the government. But what we're seeing actually is that the government doesn't trust the people, and you can see that. Telling people, my goodness, how to wash their hands. I remember learning how to wash my hands when I was in school. Okay. When I was in grade school, sing happy birthday, suds it up, make sure you get onto your wrists, go and rinse it off, make sure the water was hot, things like that. I mean, it's not that difficult of a thing. And yet the government's sitting out here trying to act like it has to tell us how to wash our hands. There's nothing wrong. And I think the right approach, or the best approach that I've seen from an executive office, is that in Texas, the governor, where I think it's Governor Abbott, he comes out and he says, these are recommendations. I don't have the right to take away your freedoms, essentially. And I think Trump said something like that, actually, even here recently, which was a breath of fresh air. Although I think he needs to quit pretending like the 3'2" doctor is our president, because he's not. I'm sorry, we didn't elect him. He really should have no right to be telling the nation what to do. He can advise the president, of course. The president can get advice from wherever he wants, but I don't think he should be the one addressing the people of the United States and telling us this. He's not our representative. We didn't elect him. At least I don't remember that election coming up. Maybe I've been brain dead here for a little while, but I really see that the problem is that the government isn't trusting the people, and somewhat it's our own fault because we haven't been virtuous. We haven't been a righteous people. And that's what we need to start cleaning up first, because these other things come alongside. Now, it's not like this thing where, we just leave things like the Second Amendment behind, or different things like that. We need to push those ideas too, because those are big. But I really think if we're going to have a successful conservative resurgence, so to say, to steal a word from the Southern Baptist Convention, in the United States here, we need to lead with righteousness and figure out, the biblical form of righteousness again, rediscover that.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things too, where we kind of need to have two separate approaches, and I think especially as Christians, right? So like on one hand, we there is the policy route, there is the conservative political side of things, that in that direction we can be partnering with non-Christians, because that's more of a secular how the government works and functions and that sort of thing. But then on the Christian side of things, going parallel with the push on conservative values, I think that there needs to be a resurgence of actually going out and preaching the gospel, because that's really something that's been, I think, lost. And I just posted an article today on the GK talking about when's the last time you actually saw a prominent pastor go out and preach the gospel to the lost. And I think that there's a lot of talking about the gospel. There's conferences like Together for the Gospel. There's organizations like the Gospel Coalition, which isn't really about the gospel, but in name it is. But I think that we need to actually get back to evangelism and winning the lost.
Absolutely.
Because if we were actually winning the lost, our country would totally change. And I think we've seen that throughout history with different pastors when they would go out and preach the gospel, and we saw a moral change in the outlook of our country for a period of time. And I think that's missing drastically right now.
Right. 100%. I think that if you look back at the founding of our nation, as I mentioned here, you did have guys like Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine, who weren't Christians, really. I mean, they were, I would say they were outside of orthodoxy. They were heterodox, and Thomas Paine I wouldn't even, consider a Christian. So there was a secular element that was there, and of course there is policy that was made. Okay, the Constitution of the United States, it's a wonderful document, but it's not a doctrinal statement. In that sense, it's much different than our church's constitution. Completely different than that. Now, there are some principles that definitely you can go and see and are the same, and that's because I think that the principles of the Constitution of the United States were framed out of biblical principles. But I think you're exactly right. Well, if we really want to see a resurgence in conservatism, we do need to be out preaching the gospel, because it's not just the minds of people that we need to win. We need to win the hearts of people. And I was just talking to somebody who worked on the Ron Paul campaign. I couldn't remember if it was Rand or Ron there, but it was the Ron Paul campaign. He was a really big strategist actually for him. Did quite a bit of the groundwork and stuff like that. So he has quite a bit of connections with what we would call the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. And he said, he was appalled at seeing all of these libertarians going out and saying, yes, we need the government to go in to shut us down even more, put us on stay at home. I mean, is there anything more of an anti-libertarian position than the government stepping up and saying you have to stay at home? I mean, that's completely anti-libertarian. And so he was telling me this, and it just reminded me here, these people probably had their hearts won over by some kind of a conservative movement and a conservative flavor and things like that. But a lot of them probably didn't have their hearts won over. And so when fear came in, they didn't have that anchor, because really the only true anchor we can have in this life is Jesus Christ. He is the anchor for the soul. He is the anchor, I would say, for the mind and the heart too. And when fear comes in, COVID-19, that's a scary thing, especially when people are telling you, 2 million people in the United States are going to die was the first prediction there. And of course, that's changed quite a bit now. But when people act in that kind of a way, when the NBA shuts down, when all these different entertainment entities start losing money, and all they've been about is money, that's kind of a scary thing and a bad sign and a bad signal. And you start to look at their actions and you start to freak out a little bit. It does get scary, and it is easier to leave your principle when fear comes in, and to leave that net of what we would call safety or liberty in order to get safety. But the thing is that if we have Jesus Christ as our Savior, as he tells us in 2 Timothy, he hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. And so we can go and take necessary precautions. There are good precautions to take. You shouldn't be going out, and saw a video of a YouTuber who went and licked a toilet and then got coronavirus.
Shocker.
Don't be that guy. We call that stupid tax. Don't do that.
And let me just clarify. Don't do that whether there's coronavirus or not. Just don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to really get into this discussion too much because I feel like I've talked about it quite a bit. We've had church service here, in-person church service, not online service, and people have come and said all kinds of things about me. If I'm being completely honest here, I'm a bit of a hypochondriac. Okay, if somebody comes into our church just on a normal Sunday, and I find out that, on Monday that Sunday night they were throwing up, I'm like, oh no, I have the stomach flu. And for the next 3 hours, I'm like, oh, convinced I have the stomach flu. This isn't something that I would want to stand against, this whole COVID-19 thing. But it's one of those things of, I flush public toilets with my foot. Okay. I'm not doing the whole hand thing. No, that's gross. And I absolutely hate the automatic toilets because they go off and you cannot get out of that stall quick enough. And that water is just spraying everywhere. That's just gross. Okay. But, you look at these things here, we do need to have a sound mind about these things. And liberty is very precious, and it is very dangerous to give up our liberties because history would say you cannot regain liberty without bloodshed. And we don't want a war. We don't want a civil war. We don't want to have to fight for our liberties, and we certainly don't want tyranny. And people would go and say, I've had people say, we trust the character of Donald Trump. I don't know if I would quite go that far that I trust the character of Donald Trump. He couldn't keep his marriage vows, so I'm a little cautious to go that far that I trust him if we give him a power trip. But a lot of conservatives have a lot of different approach than me. But the bigger question is, though, and I think the more pressing question is, what about our president in 2024? Or after 2024? What about our president in 2028? What are those guys going to do? Because it's not like, hey, maybe Jesus comes back and we don't have to worry about all this. But if he's coming back, we don't have to worry about all this anyway. What are you doing being afraid of the coronavirus? But there will be a president eventually after Donald Trump. And are we going to want to have a precedent that says our liberties are of no value? Would you want the AOC to come out here and be your president and have a precedent of no liberties? That sounds pretty stupid to me. So.
Hey, 2024 could be Kanye West versus AOC. I'm just saying. But
that would be interesting.
That would be a fascinating debate. I'm just saying. But I think also like the other side of it too is that a lot of pastors and a lot of Christians say defending our rights is selfish. Like, why should we go out there and defend our rights? Because that's just being self-centered, thinking about me first, not about other people, not about helping the poor, helping the migrant. That's not very caring. That's being self-centered and focusing on my rights and what I want and things like that. So what's the right way to respond to those kinds of criticisms?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very short-term viewed. As the first thing is, I think that's short-sighted. It's selfish now is what people would say. Well, first of all, take precautions. Nobody thinks it's selfish to let people go to Walmart right now and to get groceries. I think that I have enough faith in the church. I know this is wild to think that our churches can be cleaner than a Walmart cart. I really do. It's wild and crazy. I know that's a wild and crazy position, but I really think it is. And nobody thinks that it's selfish for people to go and to get food. And the reality of it is that they say, well, that's a necessity. Well, Jesus said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And, we look at that's talking about there is a spiritual element to life too. The other thing is I think it is selfish to want people to survive physically and not have people survive spiritually. We want to be sharing the gospel. We want to go and be showing that, hey, we cannot be afraid of death even. Why? Because we know where we're going when we die. That's another thing. The other thing I would say, and this is a huge thing to Christians, and it rightly should be, is the life movement. Now, people would go and say it's not pro-life. Russell Moore would go out and say it's not pro-life to go and to have church services. It's selfish. You're risking people's lives, things like that during this whole COVID-19 crisis. well, do we really think that we're going to win the battle for the liberties and the freedoms of and the constitutional rights of the unborn if we're not standing up for our own constitutional rights? And in case we're curious too, I think it's like 1 week or something like that of abortions is equal to more than the worldwide deaths that have been reported for the coronavirus. I understand I'm diving into the realm of pragmatics when I'm saying that. And I'm not trying to say one life is above another because one death is too many. I get that. But when we look at that, it is kind of something to start to look at here. Are we really fighting for the unborn if we don't fight for our freedoms? Because how can we fight for their freedoms if we don't have any freedoms to exercise, to fight with?
Yeah, and so it's also one of those things too where I would say that, it's not just fighting for our own freedoms. It's fighting for everybody's freedoms. And so that's fighting for the freedom of the person in the inner city that wants to get out of that, but they're being held back because of overly aggressive regulations that doesn't allow them to start a business, makes it difficult to get out of their poor communities. If you promote freedom for everybody, to me, that's the least selfish thing you can do, as opposed to sit back and saying the government owes me something.
Right.
Like just looking at it strictly from that perspective, capitalism and freedom has helped get more people out of poverty than anything else, and socialism and communism has taken more wealth and sent them into poverty more than any other system. So we got to look at that too.
Right, and I think that you're really hitting on something there, because right now, now granted it's kind of a self-inflicted wound, but right now capitalism does not seem, in the next 5 minutes, it doesn't seem like it's the best thing for our nation. And that's what a lot of people would go out and say. I think long-term capitalism is, and it's because I think that principle, if you have the right principle, it always plays out to the right. And so if liberty is the right principle here, or if this is a self-government idea, a self-government sphere, it will ultimately play out for what is best for our nation, for what is best for this generation, for the next generation and generations to come after that. And I do want to go out here and say this too. I'm not saying that churches have to be open. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think that churches should have the right to decide, to make that decision, that they should be the ones making that decision if they want to shut their doors or not. And that's was the intent of, I know, the governor of Texas's position was that he couldn't shut down churches. It was for those churches to decide. And that's my point. It might make more sense, if you have 500 people, you have zero technology in your church, and you have a relatively crammed building that was like bursting at the seams anyways, and you can't do any social distancing. It might make sense to cancel your service, especially if the weather wasn't good enough to have an outdoor service or something like that, or if you didn't have enough space to do an outdoor service. It might make sense. I don't know. There's all kinds of different things to factor in and to think about and to look towards with that. But one thing I do know is that the government shouldn't be making that decision.
Yeah, and it's gonna be interesting to see how these rights are either re-implemented or continued to be taken away coming out of this crisis, and for the foreseeable future. Because when you think about it, they may still limit large gatherings. They may still put a cap off and say you can't have over 200 people in a building or in a room or in a gathering or something like that. That's going to affect a lot of churches. It's going to affect a lot of businesses. It's still going to affect a lot, and it is infringing on our right to peaceably assemble, our right to freedom of religion, and to practice what we believe and worship God as we see fit. It's going to be really interesting to see how we as the American people respond to, more than likely, the continual taking away of our freedoms and our right to decide what we feel is best, because clearly big government knows better than any of us.
Yeah, when you hit on the right to assemble, and this is something that it started to be talked about, and it's kind of interesting because the Church at Planned Parenthood kind of went through a fight with this, and we were talking about it probably, I don't know, a month and a half, 2 months ago or so, Jeff, and this is a much bigger right than what people think. Most people are saying like, well, so what? You can't assemble. It's not a big deal. Who cares? Well, the loud minority can ultimately defeat a silent majority. And the best way to do that is to make the silent majority feel like they're in the minority. And you do that by isolating them. If you're sitting at your home and you're the only one who has this thought process of, really churches should be able to make their own decision, or, they're taking away my liberties. These things are being infringed upon. This is wrong. Maybe you're against a forced vaccination that seems like is the inevitable with the outcome of this COVID-19 crisis. If you're sitting there, but all of a sudden the only thing you're hearing is secular news that's saying, oh, no, government knows best. Government knows best. In fact, government needs to make it even worse. And you're sitting there at home alone, and you can't assemble, and you can't talk to anybody else who's like-minded, even if 98% of the nation thinks like you, but we're all, putting our own little segments and we can't join together. We have no idea, and we can absolutely be defeated by a tiny minority in our nation, just because they've isolated and segregated us, and they've hurt our right to assemble peaceably and to just discuss these ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's been kind of the strategy in them trying to defeat Trump in 2020 as well, is they've made it to where you can't publicly state any kind of support for him. You can't even really promote conservative values, or else they label you as a racist, or they label you as a bigot, or they, you have to be quiet. I mean, I'm out here in California. Like, you have to be careful what color hat you wear, or else you could get beat up. Like, that's the reality of what we deal with out here. And I think that that's one of those ways of trying to intimidate people and to make them feel isolated in a way. So that way, the only people that are able to unify are the non-conservatives, and are the people that are pushing these progressive leftist socialistic ideas.
Yeah, well, and it's crazy that you say that too in California, and of course we know California as this progressive state and everything like that, but one small fact that we often forget is that California actually has the most by raw numbers here, the most Republicans in the entire state. Now, granted, it's because they're, you guys have a lot bigger population than states like Iowa and things like that. But I mean, there are more Republicans in California than any other state, even than Texas, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, well, and also too, I was following the primaries that were going on out here in California, because we've already had them, and Trump in the primary, running unopposed, had a ridiculous amount of votes going for him. If I remember, and don't fully quote me on it, but I think he had more votes this time around than he did last time in the primary. And I'll have to go double check that.
I'm sure he did.
Yeah. And what's crazy is that, like, we're literally talking about in California in a primary, he had a ridiculous amount of support and votes. And so it's going to be interesting to see, is it that people are just fed up and that they're going to actually make sure that they come out and vote, or is it and they just feel like they are being isolated, so now they've got more motivation to go out there? And is this going to be a countrywide kind of mentality as well, to defeat Biden or whoever the heck they put in charge of the Democratic, for the nomination?
All I have to say is, kind of on my wish list right now is that Biden and Trump do a debate. I don't care if it's over Zoom and they show it or what they do, but I mean, it would just be so entertaining. It really wouldn't be too fair, but it would be very entertaining.
Yeah, I'm still predicting that leading up to the Democratic primary, maybe even like the day before, the day of, Biden's doctor is going to come out and diagnose him with dementia or Alzheimer's and say he's not fit to be president. And then they're gonna fill him in with somebody else. That's what I think is gonna happen. So,
I mean, there's a pretty good chance of that, and I think there's zero chance that somebody else is going to be Bernie Sanders, because otherwise they would have just let Bernie Sanders win.
Yeah.
And I mean, clearly they weren't going to do that. I mean, I'm not too much into conspiracy theories here, but I mean, there was definitely a conspiracy against Bernie Sanders. Don't agree at all with Bernie Sanders policy-wise or anything like that, but man, that guy got the raw end of the stick, 2 election cycles in a row from the Democrats. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens there, because I have a feeling that his base is going to be pretty upset, and he's going to want to come and try to split the Democrat Party, which that'd be great. I think that'd be wonderful if he did that.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see too who replaces him. I have a feeling it's going to be either Newsom or Cuomo, which would probably be the best opportunity for Democrats, way better than Hillary. So.
Yeah, although Hillary versus Trump, round 2 would be pretty good. Another name that you could throw out there would be kind of like in a dire situation like that, and if our nation is still like either just collapsing economically from COVID-19, I wonder if they try to run Obama. I wonder if they try to go in to bend some rules and get Obama back out there. That's not a prediction or anything like that. That's not even thought through. That's shooting from my hip. So no inside information.
Yeah, hey, they could throw Michelle up there and just, who knows? You never know. So yeah. Well, hey, I totally appreciate you coming on. Really enjoyed it as always. And also too, want to remind everybody, pre-order Sam's book coming out this summer, 5 Steps to Kill a Nation. If you go to gatekeepersonline.com/store, you can pre-order that. Use the code SAM and you'll get 10% off of that pre-order. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Really always enjoy having you on our conversations, and both on air and off. So
yeah, sounds great. Thanks for having me, Jeff. As always, it's been great.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, everybody tune in. We will be back tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to be back with Dustin Faulkner, who is trying to beat out Sam for the most times on Conversations with Jeff. So make sure that you tune in tomorrow. We'll be going live with him. And then we've got a new show pretty much coming out every day. Next week as well, Wednesday evening, we're having on Sam's co-host, Patrick, No Compromise with Evil Wyatt. So that'll be the other half of the Shining Light podcast. So make sure you guys tune in for that as well. And then, tune in tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. for the America Held Hostage podcast, where John and I are going to be bringing you guys the news. Tune in then here on Facebook, and we will see you guys then.